the order. The motion is this House believes that the state is morally illegitimate, and I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open up the debate within 7 minutes. Here.
Hi, before I start, am I audible? Starting in 3, 2, 1. I know Hobbes said that life in the state of nature was nasty, brutish, and short, but Hobbes was also an asshole who was lying and didn't know anything about the state of nature. Before I move on to why the state is inherently immoral, I just want to point out what we support, what we don't support, and what our model kind of looks like. We say at opening government that any collective aggregation of individuals such that it inhibits, 1, the freedom of other individuals within that, again, same territory, or 2, the freedom of individuals and their ability to cooperate with each other across state lines, across boundary lines, across regions. Any sort of collective aggregation of individuals that limits these things is inherently immoral and is also bad for the world in terms of consequences. What do we support? We would like to go back to the state of nature, pre-modern communities, and I want you to visualize this because, again, this is a motion that requires immense visualization. These are communities where you don't necessarily need to live in one space for a really long period of time. If you prefer to live there, you can live there, but you constantly move. And there are reasons for this, right? Like you need resources. Perhaps you were in one place and the resources of that area were depleted and you had to move to another area. And lots of other reasons for why people kept on moving and had freedom. Or maybe you were just a woman who disliked her dad, who was an asshole, and you just wanted to move away from the dad. There are lots of reasons why people just kept on moving. This also doesn't mean that there is no cooperation within these communities, right? So for instance, if you wanted to hunt an animal, or even if you want to go mega and say mine a coal mine, you still need other people to work with you. So there is some degree of cooperation, but crucially note that anybody who does not want to cooperate is free to, 1, not cooperate, and 2, move out and go into another community or whatever. Okay, that done. The first argument, why do states necessarily inhibit freedom and consent? At the top of this, I want to note the premise of this argument, which is there is an inherent separateness of identities within individuals. What does this mean? Every single individual in the world has different lived experiences. They have different memories. They have different cognitive and motivational dispositions, which means that everybody's understanding of who they are, what kind of life they want to live, is necessarily different. Why do states then inhibit, or at the very least come at the cost of the separateness of identities? States must necessarily aggregate these identities and make decisions based on this aggregation, right? So they can't ever account for individual differences and individual likes or dislikes. If you want to give money to the poor, you must tax the rich. There is no other way for you to do it. For them to function, you must necessarily make bureaucracies which implement policies that affect a whole bunch of people. Why is this then a fundamental moral problem? Because we think that because of this separateness of identities, every individual is uniquely valuable and you can never choose one individual over the other. That is to say that even if there are more numbers on one side and more people ascribe to say one kind of identity over the other or one kind of motivational disposition over the other, it is an inherently arbitrary decision that somebody was born in a place or at a time where some people, for instance, had motivational dispositions or had certain kinds of thoughts that aggregated and then fucked over their thoughts and their experiences and what they wanted out of life, right? So people don't have control over this. And states necessarily make policies such that you must then discard these individuals. And this crucially comes at the cost of their freedom. I would also want to note that states necessarily take over consent of individuals in multiple ways. And by states, by the way, I'm looking at like kingdoms, fucking dictatorships, and even democracies. Like very trivially speaking, dictatorships and kingdoms obviously don't have buy-in. They have no consent whatsoever. So they're obviously limiting consent. But let's look at democracies because I think that's the best case scenario of opposition world. I say democracies do something very similar. So I think there's one category of reasons which apply across democracies for why they don't have buy-in. So these are things like states promoting voter apathy by fucking over lots of groups again and again and again. I want to note, by the way, these minority groups can't really escape these sorts of states. If you're an Ahmadi person in Pakistan because you have a fucking Pakistani passport, you can't just up and leave the fucking country because you have boundaries between between states, right? So I think one, states can promote apathy and that removes consent. You oftentimes need financial resources to get power, ethnic groups, blah, blah, blah. All of this sort of stuff means that some communities don't get power. Now, opposition can come up and say, well, they might not get power in your world as well. Let's look at an inherent condition within states which just takes over this reason, which is states necessarily need to have bureaucracies, guys. Like, if you're building a fucking road or managing a fucking hospital, you need people who are administrators to take care of these policies, to make guidelines, and for people to follow those guidelines. Very evidently speaking, people within bureaucracies are not elected by people on the ground. You don't get to choose who your hospital administrator is within a specific region and so on. You have very limited capacity to change these people within these positions, and your capacity, even in the best case scenario where states choose these sorts of bureaucrats, is one, these never come on the policy agenda, right? There are so many bureaucracies, you will never have the information to make these sorts of decisions, right? So these people will necessarily be screwed over. The second thing then, on cooperation, but before that, I'll take CEO.
Yeah, sure, Taha. What does it mean for something to be legitimate?
I don't know, you tell me. All I'm saying is they fuck over freedom and therefore they're not legitimate. Okay, cooperation and compassion. I want to note two things at the top of this argument. One, states necessarily need unifying myths. You don't have buy-in towards states if you can't tell we are American and therefore American exceptionalism, whatnot. Every single state needs this because you need to motivate people to, one, give taxes to the state, but also work according to the law. All of those sorts of structural incentives to do so. The second thing I obviously noted on the top of my speech is boundaries, etc., are a necessary component of states. Why is this bad then? Because global cooperation and cooperation on issues that affect individuals from far-flung areas never receive attention at the point at which you say our local identity is important. In our world, we envision people cooperating based not on what their identities are, but based on what their fucking interests are. And that is something that states necessarily divert from. I want to note three things within this argument. Firstly, because you have the ability to choose where you want to go, there's a lot more movement. This movement can be based on more resources, but two, if you live in oppressive structures, you can also move out. And three, the important bit of this argument is a lack of empathy is a necessary component of a world in which states exist. Because note panel, that empathy is only extended in our world to people who are in our in-group, not in people who are our out-group. That's why we don't care about people in Africa dying of hunger, but we would care if our neighbor, for instance, did not have access to food. We take this apart, the point at which people freely move and are able to interact with each other and therefore understand their own lived experiences, are able to understand that somebody is worthy of our compassion to begin with. For all these reasons, very proud.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to now invite the leader of the opposition. Here.
All right, can I be heard?
Yep.
Just gonna pop my computer somewhere else, one sec. I want to establish two things and set up at the top of this speech. The first thing to note is that this is a debate about the concept of the state as opposed to the permutations of the state and wherever it might exist, which would preclude closing government from running a series of arguments about how, for instance, the North Korean government is illegitimate. We are concerned with the question of what do states as an entity look like and whether they are legitimate or not. The second note of setup is that this is a debate about moral legitimacy, something that the member of the opposition points out that the opening government team does not address in any meaningful fashion. What does it mean for something to be morally legitimate? The first thing to note is that something that is morally legitimate is separate from something that is morally good or morally bad, which is to say moral legitimacy points to whether someone ought to be permitted in a reasonable fashion or an actor to take that action, which is to say that I currently have money that I could be donating to save people's lives, but I am not taking that action. And that is certainly a moral harm, but it is still morally legitimate for me to perform that action for the reason that we say that I have a claim to that money. Which means that this debate is primarily a question of whether states should be allowed to function and exist in the fashion that they do, something that the opening government team has not meaningfully addressed in this debate. So we're going to make two further contributions to this debate. The first one is a question of the counterfactual. And our claim will essentially be that where something is necessary, we must accept it as morally legitimate. So insofar as you believe that the counterfactual world would be a worse world, you must first accept that states are necessary to exist to avoid all of those harms. And secondly, you must therefore accept that they are morally legitimate. The second thing I'm going to do is deal with the question of consent proposed by this opening government team. Let's begin with the first point of substantive. Our claim is that where something is necessary, we must accept it as morally legitimate. Let's establish that as a moral truth in this debate. There are many examples that demonstrate this fact, but I think the most pertinent is the question of parenthood. We accept that parents are allowed to entirely abrogate the rights of children. They can make decisions on their behalf. They can do things that we consider to be morally harmful to those children, but we accept that they have that power because we accept it as a necessity for them to do that because there is no other actor who is able to do the things that they are able to do. And in the counterfactual, those children would be worse off. And in fact, this question of moral legitimacy being tied to necessity is reflected in almost every single accepted justice system in the world, where we accept necessity as a legitimate defense for having done something morally harmful. We accept it as legitimate, and thereby we accept that that individual ought not to be punished. We would extend this principle to the concept of states as an actor. So what that means is that this is a debate that demands an understanding of the counterfactual. If you are reasonably satisfied that the counterfactual world would be worse, that means you must accept states as necessary, and thereby you must accept them as legitimate. So let's establish why the state is necessary. We think there are two grounds on which the state is necessary. The first ground is that the state is necessary to ascertain all of the other principled outcomes that we accept as important in the world. For instance, if you believe people's right to freedom of speech, to food, to shelter, to having their identity protected is important, it is our belief that it is only through the state that those outcomes are achieved. But secondly, we believe that all of the other tertiary practical outcomes are also only achieved through the state. We believe the state is the arbiter of good outcomes for the reason that they're the body that is large enough to do the thing, like they're the only body large enough to often get outcomes that we want. They apply checks and balances to the worst abuses of power that would exist in the counterfactual, and they're the only actor that is able to barter on account of the individual, which is to say that they act as a representative for the individual achieving outcomes that the individual otherwise would not be able to. For instance, trading with other states, for example. So with that out of the way, let's prove this. What would an absence of states actually look like? Three things here. Firstly, there is no centralized set of governing rules or institutions with the power to enforce those rules. Importantly, that means that all of the rules that are important to keep people in check, to stop men doing horrible things to women, to stop men murdering other men, are only enforced by the state, and this opening government team needs to prove that they would be enforced by some other counterfactual mechanism. Importantly, this means that every instance in which the state prevents something like this from happening through the deterrence mechanism of the law or the incapacitation mechanism of the law, they are achieving legitimacy, even if they generate other external negative harms. Secondly, there would be no institutions with which to allocate resources to those who need them, because this opening government team can certainly not claim in their world there would be absolute parity amongst individuals. It is only through the state that individuals who have little are able to be given enough to survive in the first instance. And thirdly, and importantly, there would be no engine of advancement, so to speak, i.e. things like industrialization. Noticing that the state both is the only body practically able to make these things happen through the coagulation of things like tax money, which is able to provide advancement to society, but also through the reason that they are able to incentivize collectivization where it would otherwise not exist, leading to the development of things like medicine. If you support people living past the age of 50, you certainly support states. All of this means that we are talking about a world where the strong can perpetually abuse and take resources from the weak under opening government. And they have done nearly no work to demonstrate why that would not be the case. I'm happy to take the Deputy Prime Minister.
Do you respect other people's human rights because the state might prosecute you?
Yes, I actually, in large part, do. For the reason that, firstly, it's unclear to me what those rights would be in your world, for the reason that they're not clearly delineated, and you only need to point to a time pre-states, not that long ago, where the vast majority of people weren't even aware that others had rights, see the existence of slavery. But B, it's not just a question of whether I, a moral person, would do this, but the vast majority of people who are willing to put aside morals for the purpose of self-satisfaction or for the purpose of protecting themselves in other ways. With that out of the way, let's address the positive material coming from this government bench. They raise a question of consent. Their claim is essentially that states remove the ability of individuals to act in the fashion they want to, and this makes them morally illegitimate. The first thing we would note is that it is a good thing if the state removes the ability of individuals to act in the fashion they want to, because as we point out, individuals often want to act in negative fashions. You do not have eternal positive rights to the extent that they incur upon others negative rights. But the second thing to note is that we deny the claim that consent is legitimate grounds in this debate for opening government to win for a number of reasons. The first thing to note is that where individuals do not express negative preferences, incursions upon consent must be considered legitimate and acceptable, which is to say that consent is only important insofar as when people interact with the world, they would have it be one way. So consent is only important if they would prefer it to be the other way. And our claim is that the vast majority of the world prefers the existence of states because they gain so much from the existence of states. And that is reflected by the enormous popularity of them existing and the relative scarcity of things like anarchists. And what that means is that their claims exclusively apply to the set of people for whom the state's existence is objectionable. And even for that set of people, we don't care about consent for 4 reasons. Firstly, because those individuals are able to express control over the state, whether it be through means like electoral means or things like overthrowing governments or the state's inbuilt incentives to keep them happy to stop revolution, or for the reason that they're able to opt out and move to other states. Secondly, for the reason that there is reciprocity, for the reason they get something back from the state, and many of the things the states take only exist if for the state's existence, things like tax dollars. Thirdly, for the reasons of checks and balances against the states doing any of the bad things they point to. And fourthly, for the reason that the comparative benefit to the vast majority of people for whom this group does not apply is much larger than for this group. On those grounds, states are legitimate. We prove what legitimacy is, and we give you the best moral justification for why states are legitimate. Vote opening opposition.
Thank you for that fine speech. I'd like to now invite the DPM here.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I want you to notice 2 semantic tricks that leader of opposition tried to pull off. Trick number 1, morally good does not mean morally legitimate. We want things which are necessary. And by the way, necessity stems from good consequences. They're basically saying the same thing that we're saying, except they added this additional semantic jump of necessity. Hence, their framing attempt to take us out of the debate is the same thing that their case is guilty of. Second semantic trick the leader of opposition tries to pull off. Lots of scientific advancements have come in the last 500 years. People have been better off. States are responsible. That's sort of like saying most religious people throughout history paid charity, hence religion is good. But most fucking people across the planet were religious. That's a correlation error. Obviously, the last 500 years of advancement have been because of states, because fucking states existed. I don't see how you can make that correlation. Like econometricians are literally writhing in horror at what leader of opposition just said. 2 semantic tricks from their side. I want to talk about 3 things. The first thing I want to talk about is identity, because we believe that the state is a mind-forged manacle that we need to break free of. It is a contraption of identity and not of interest. Why is this true? In Pakistan, there are single mothers who could probably use help. In Nairobi, there are probably single mothers who could probably use help. In Nicaragua, there's probably single mothers who could use help. So a lot of people have common interests across the globe, which are not spatially constrained. But Pakistan somehow has to justify itself for being Pakistan, right? So the only way that any country can necessarily justify its own existence, limited within the confines of its territorial borders, is through identity. That there is something about Pakistanis that's different from the people of Kenya and from the people of Nicaragua. What we want is a community of people who are united by a confluence of interests, not by this contraption of identity, which is created, which is the premise of the nation state. How then does this affect the debate? The first reason that this affects the debate is because it takes out a lot of their arguments about principled outcomes and necessity, right? Because necessity is necessarily ideologically defined. Necessity is an essentially contested concept. It's not the sort of concept that everyone can objectively look at and say, this XYZ is necessary. But 2, and I want to point out, these people are actively inhibited from pursuing their interests to the fullest possible extent, insofar as they're not allowed to exit the confines of the territory that they did not choose to consent to be born in. Their only mitigation here was, you can leave. How many fucking Pakistanis can leave? How many fucking Indians can leave? How many fucking people across the African and South American continent can leave? This argument, again, works in a debate room. In the real world, does not tend to be true. The second thing that I want to talk about, which I think is really important, is the limitation inherent to democracies. I'm going to talk about 3 things here. The first thing I want to do is engage with their argument about guaranteeing good outcomes for people. The inherent to this argument is the idea that the state's monopoly on violence is necessary to ensure that fundamental rights are protected. I just want to intuition pump this. This is bullshit because people do not violate other people's human rights because of fear of persecution. I asked leader of opposition this. He was still willing to win this debate. So in front of a stream of 200 people, he said, yeah, I don't violate other people's inherent human rights because the state might jail me. I'm going to call bullshit on that and say that there's an inherent goodness to all of us, that the people judging this debate and the people watching this debate don't hurt each other, don't torture each other, not because of the fear of punishment, but because we see something in each other, a humanity that is bigger than all of us. But the second thing I want to point out with regards to the monopoly of the violence of the state is that this state's monopoly on violence is selectively exercised. This completely misses Taha's argument that Pashtuns are selectively persecuted in Pakistan, that Malay people are selectively persecuted across Southeast Asia, that African Americans are persecuted by fuckers wearing this fucking hat. So that's a problem, right? Like, you have people who selectively use this monopoly on violence to ensure that some people are better off and other people are worse off. The final thing that I want to point out in terms of this is that there's two additional problems with democracy. A, the idea of the benevolent dictatorship, and two, the tyranny of the majority. Necessarily, there's a temporal gap between when democracies are elected, which means that for 4 years, they will be making a confluence of decisions that people will never be able to meaningfully consent to. For those 4 years, you are literally down to the benevolence of Donald Trump, of Boris Johnson, or whoever it is for that matter, whatever decisions be, in terms of them making decisions which affect our lives meaningfully. Secondly, the tyranny of the majority. Necessarily, no matter how many constitutional protections you put in, you will necessarily default to the will of the majority, putting the minority at the risk. For these reasons, these aggregations do not work out in any sense. The final thing that I want to talk about, which I think is really important, is to do with how cooperation is affected on our world. But before I do that, I'm happy to take engagement from closing opposition ideally, otherwise, See, do you have anything? Why don't you go for it?
Yeah. So the problem is that this debate isn't actually hypothetical. We know what the world was like pre-state, and it was bloody, violent, and brutal.
Okay, no, it wasn't, right? Because I've also read those European histories. But if you walk a mile in subaltern shoes, or like you've read African literature or anything, you will realize, vis-a-vis books, that these people often collectively work with each other. Tribes collectively work with each other. Jirgas collectively work with each other. Tribal councils collectively work with each other. There's been a history of cooperation. And the point I'm trying to make, and I think this goes to a broader difference between opening opposition and opening government. They keep saying that history tells us that the state is better. We're saying that the history was constructed by the state. The history was constructed by the state to justify its own existence. There's a reason that we think that the US is the bastion of democracy. It's because we read their fucking books. And there's a reason that we think that the Treaty of Westphalia and the sovereignty that underpins the Treaty of Westphalia is great. It's because we're taught that consistently vis-a-vis our media, vis-a-vis the way we conduct ourselves, and again, vis-a-vis the nationalistic identities that we necessarily have to adopt because states have to justify the borders within which they operate. The final thing then I talk about is cooperation, which I think is really important. With reference to cooperation is a couple of things which happen which prevent change in their world. Firstly, you necessarily think along communal lines. And I want you to think about how arbitrary this is. So I come from a country of 200 million people, and I have been as much in common with them with about like 199 million of them as I do with someone from fucking Latin America. I have no common interest with these people, no common lived experiences with these people, and yet I'm supposed to think that we're a common community. This prevents us from taking change on the genuine threats which we face. Note the confluence of interest argument at the top of my speech. The point at which you're not constrained by identity, but focus on your very intuitive, what is better for me, is when you're likely to face on truly global challenges, which the state completely prevents and ensnares from us ever working on effectively. Panel, the state is a mind-forged manacle that is used to justify its own existence. We must finally break free. It is truly morally legitimate. I am so proud to propose.
I thank the DPM for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the DLO to summarize the opening half. Here.
Sorry, I'm doing something.
Can you test your mic again?
Yeah, sorry. Ollie was just speaking. I'm audible?
Yep, clearly.
Opening government at their best prove that there are unique moral harms to the existence of the state. But they never properly establish that they strip the state of any vestige of legitimacy, or even that it is more legitimate than the counterfactual, which they eventually agree with based on the way they set up this debate. I'm going to start by looking at their positive material and then dealing with the additional claims made at DPM. Then I'm going to whip our positive material, which gets reasonably little consent. First, I want to deal with the setup created by this team, which is pre-agricultural societies. The first thing to say in response to this is that it's still a form of collective aggregation, yeah? Because you can still have people say, you have to fish or hunt, you have to sleep with that tribal leader. And this team says, well, hold on, you can leave, to which there are 4 things to say. First, there are far more limited options if you are a rural serf in Mongolia. Like there are just far fewer states with established collective identities, and it's difficult to move to one who have the positive rights to describe. Second, you were attacked more easily and more readily by other tribes for the simple reason that you were different and perceived of as a threat. The third thing to say is that your own tribe has an incentive to intimidate you, to not allow you to leave so that they can maintain their collective power. The fourth thing to say is the same cultural and spiritual narratives exist. So when this team talks about American nationalism, those things still exist on a micro scale in pre-agricultural societies. The second claim they make is that states harm on the basis of aggregation of national interests or total interests. There are 2 things to say here. The first is that we dispute the basic premise, which is to say that subsets of individuals within a state can be geographically represented in a series of ways. For instance, you can be geographically represented within your own electorate. You can opt out and move to a community separate within that state, which has far less purview and interaction from that state. You can form a lobbying group and actively try and push for your national interests. The second thing to say is that a state is a precondition for most rights in the first place. 3 things to say here. First, the state protects you from your negative rights being infringed upon, which is a precondition for you exercising any of those positive rights. So in the absence of a state and all of Ollie's good positive material around how states have, as both teams concede, monopolies on force and violence and create a series of laws, and I'll talk about them and their responses in a second, all guarantee you that form of protection, which are necessary. Second, it provides you the impetus for the positive rights you're trying to protect in the first place. So you don't have a right to drive in their world. You may have your right to drive taken away in our world, but at least you have the roads that are necessary for you to have that positive right in the first place. So our team gives you far more of those positive rights. Third, states are a precondition for enormous quality of life improvements like the development of medicine. I'll talk about their responses more in a second. The next thing they say is that states promote apathy in minority communities. Ollie gives you a series of reasons why this is untrue. They respond to one of them, which is saying some people can't leave, i.e. in Pakistan. But note that all of Ollie's other material, like rioting and like voting and all of those democratic materials, are still in the debate. And the thing to say here is that, firstly, you can still move rurally, you can still cross borders, even though there is a way to make that more difficult. Second, you need to be comparative because the strong and powerful still dominate in your world just within that smaller group, and you've never proven after 2 speakers why you still do not get top-down oppression just in a smaller subset of people. And the third thing to say is that the nature of this debate is that we aren't arguing about the average state. This is a claim about whether or not states can be morally legitimate based on the setup given at Ollie. We don't need to talk about the absolutely terrible states like, say, for instance, Rwanda in the 90s. The fourth claim they make is that bureaucrats get chosen. Fine. A, that is still scrutinized by the media and other levels of power, as Ollie tells you. And B, that is something that the vast majority of people opted into by providing their assent to the person who appointed that bureaucrat. The final thing they talk about is unifying myths. As I told you, that is symmetric. Second, there's competition between states, which means you have more community options and representation of those unifying myths. And third, greater education, which is facilitated by states, gives you greater scrutiny of those myths. So let's look at the other responses we get at DPM, which will cross-engage with their responses to that material. The first thing they say is that people have inherent goodness and see something in each other. This is an unfortunate lie, and it is obvious for the reason that this team's own analysis relies upon people with power abusing it, i.e. over minorities. So they concede that often people with power will abuse that power. Our claim is that when you have greater scrutiny, when you have concrete sets of laws and morals that are developed through the instrument of states, because states have incentives to, for instance, educate people, to promote philosophy, to ensure that people are as happy as possible and have sophisticated grasps on ethics. All of those mechanisms lead to the formation of concrete systems of morality in the first place. The second thing to say is that the only way you view people as moral actors is when they are part of your tribe, almost necessarily by their logic, which means that in their world, you do not view other people as being within your in-group and therefore act out against them. The third thing to say is it's just a matter of fact that there are a lot of warfare and skirmishes in prehistory. The next claim they make is about 4-year terms, 4 responses. First, there's a mechanism of things like impeachment to actively remove that person. Second, you can literally riot, as we saw, unfortunately, today. Third, you have the prospect of future re-election creates extremely strong incentives for you to barrack towards those people in the short term. And fourth, you have individual incentives. So Mitt Romney has an individual incentive to steer the Republican Party in a certain direction and in order to ensure his re-election as opposed to the leader's re-election. So the final claim they make is just about scientific advancement. Oh, sorry, 2 more. The first is about scientific advancements, and they say it's a correlation error. But there's a series of structural reasons why states have been able to achieve those things. First, the state has the existence of an incentive, which you do not have in separate, sparse, tiny groups of people. Second, the state has the capacity to aggregate resources. So, for instance, they can take scientific experts. They can build the institutions that educate people in the first place that are a prerequisite for that scientific knowledge. Third, the states can provide the infrastructure for things like corporations to exist, which are necessary. And fourth, the states can redistribute and source those resources in that way. Before I continue, I'll take closing comments.
Why is existence utility positive?
Okay, so I don't think you're going to be able to establish that existence is utility negative. I think the simple reason, as sad as this is just that the vast majority of people choose to live long and fruitful lives, and they probably wouldn't if existence was not utility positive. That's a very sad question, and I hope your extension is about that, but power to you. Finally, they talk about majoritarianism. The 2 things to say here. First, there exist threats to the state where you actively barrack for majoritarianism, i.e. the loss of your labor force, i.e. the death of your people, the risk of uprising. The second thing to say is that good states have fostered non-majoritarian interests, and this is a debate about good states. So for instance, look at like a large number of communities in the world like Canada actively fostering Indigenous reparations and Indigenous rights, even though that's not in the collective's interests, because the collective and the state has propagated a sense of morality as a good state, which still applies those rights to those minorities. Finally, on our positive material, which gets very little engagement, Ollie gives you a series of reasons and specific morally legitimate claims with respect to things like necessity and parenthood. Ollie then talks about why specifically the state is necessary, and there's no direct response to any of that material. Finally, Ollie gives you a litany of reasons why people can actively consent, and only a very small minority of people cannot consent to the existence of the state, and even those people still have their interests taken into account and reciprocal benefits gained. The way that this debate has been set up is about a contest between people existing in prehistory and people existing now, and the reality is that people in prehistory lived terrible, terrible lives, and the comparative was far morally worse for those people than it is today. Proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the member of the government to open up CG's case within 7 minutes. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Sure. Three, two, one. Our extension is going to be unique from opening government, and indeed opening opposition's conception of the debate, because it's not going to rely on any particular characterization of any state. I found it quite weird that we heard arguments about gerrymandering and minority persecution. I presumed we were supposed to debate at the level of generality implied by the motion, which therefore incorporates every single conceivable state that has ever existed and will ever exist. I think, therefore, that in order to win this debate, the burden upon government would be to prove that, for example, a common global democracy with perhaps, direct democracy and referenda on everything would be still illegitimate. I think that is a reasonable burden to understand when it says the state is illegitimate. So we are going to win on that ground. Firstly, to engage with the POI from CO, I'm glad they asked it. What is legitimacy? It's when something is acceptable, i.e. something we believe people ought do, under an established framework of evaluation. So a legitimate move in chess is one that complies with the rules of chess. What then is morality? Morality is the assessment of actions which, if not conformed to, undermine, degrade, or diminish the conception of our humanity. That is how we understand morality. That is what we mean when we say that something is immoral. When you conduct something that individuals or society, we prefer it didn't exist, but individuals believe to be immoral, you are, in a sense, driving us away from the conception of humanity that separates us from animals and into that of barbarism. It's why all of the things that we consider to be the most immoral, things like murder, occur blatantly within the state of nature and amongst animals, but we consider them to be morally abhorrent when they occur for humans, right? Underpinning almost all of them is the respect for consent and the respect for human dignity that comes with it. And the and the word dignity is essentially a marker of your capacity to be a moral actor, that is to have and engage in moral reasoning, right? That's why I feel no compulsion, or I ascribe no rights to, for example, I don't know, a lump of rock, because I do know that it is incapable of moral reasoning, and therefore there is no respect. There's no sense, there's no reason to respect its wishes. It has none. It cannot feel pain or anything else. Well, then, why is the capacity for moral reasoning, and indeed, rationality in general, more important, perhaps, I don't know, the ability to feel pain? Noting that opening opposition's claims rest very, very heavily upon the idea of pain being something that, is overridingly bad. The reason why the capacity for reason and particularly moral reasoning is the precondition for is so important, is because it's the precondition for anything in the universe to be valuable. In the absence of humans assigning value to things through the process of intellectual scrutiny or of moral reasoning, nothing in the world would have any value. There would be no one to experience it beyond, the senseless exploration that's driven by, the autonomous impulses of like simpler animals. And we're happy to extend this, monkeys or anything else that's also capable of some primitive moral reasoning. So why then is the state, and here is a definition of the state that I think is all-encompassing to every conception of the state, whether the tribe who forces you to go and fish in a certain river or whatever it is, or Pakistan or whatever. A state is any social structure, inclusive of some degree of hierarchy, which has the potential ability to exercise power over its constituent members without unanimous consent by those who are being ruled, right? And necessarily by those at the upper levels of the hierarchy, right? Why is this so problematic, and why is the existence of even a single state in a world otherwise absent of them illegitimate morally? Because there are second order effects to the creation of even the first state. One is that the existence of one state multiplies and demands the creation of additional states. That is to say, if one group of people have organized, they become a threat to you at the point at which they can expand. So if you are living your free, Hobbesian, blissful state of nature, by virtue of their capacity to threaten you into the future, you too must also organize. That is where the opt-out becomes impossible. At the point at which everyone is eventually organized into a state, it becomes impossible to opt out, thus violating the consent of humanity. This multiplies furthermore, and it amplifies and projects the failures of human nature by giving us a platform on which to exercise the power over others, thus violating their consent. So it's then now, and yes, opening government will write about this, but we're going to go further. What if states had never been created? Because opening opposition gives a laundry list of sob stories and horrible outcomes, and because states theoretically and could occasionally prevent some of those horrible outcomes, they claim therefore that they are morally legitimate. That is not a justification for something being moral, right? That is why, the story of Omerta, of the idea that we would not be comfortable with a society, even if it technically catered to all our wishes, that was built upon the suffering of like a girl being tortured. We would not be comfortable with a society that caters to all our material preferences if it was built upon the of slavery, because it diminishes us as humans and at the point at which it lacks the respect for human dignity, right? So in the absence of that, two things would happen. One, humans would transiently benefit from cooperation. They would willingly consent into cooperating with one another. That's not particularly interesting. Open government didn't do that, already did that. But what if no cooperation ever did occur? What if, let's take our opposition at their best and say no form of consensual social organization ever occurs beyond, the fleeting meeting of two people and they have kids and they go and forage for berries and live in the Hobbesian state of nature? Why is that still preferable? One, if your contention is that these people would live shorter lives I do not care, because it is not a moral transgression that I die at the age of 35 due to the absence of modern medication, any more than it is a moral transgression if I die now at the age of 80 because we've not yet invented nanobots that can repair my DNA. It does not matter when we die, and therefore, if the best benefit that can be accrued from the existence of a state is that of prolonging our life or of providing us with a better quality of life, that is an arbitrary heuristic by which to evaluate it, because it does not matter to people who have not experienced it. Therefore, from the perspective of being absent of the existence of the state, it's not something you ought value. Secondly, the existence of rights. If the existence of rights is accompanied by the inability to reject those rights, that is to say, rights are only meaningful if I can refuse to acknowledge them or refuse to have my rights respected in some instance, I think it's important that people opt out of what is otherwise just a set of rules that have been imposed them. The next is that all of the experiential stuff that they talk about is experienced relative to things that I've experienced otherwise, the hedonistic treadmill, if you will. So all the things they say, isn't society great because it grants you this? Yes, but that just shifts my perspective of what it is that the baseline level of acceptable goodness is. That's why there's people living in the UK who have objectively over the course of human history some of the best living standards ever known, and we would describe them as being in poverty, right? Lastly, because states necessitate social organization that enables us to compare ourselves to one another and to exchange ideas which by and large make us miserable, right? That is, all of the existence of state means that we are living in, from our perspective, things that are on an improvement trajectory, but that is only because we are experiential relative to some baseline. If that baseline doesn't exist, we have nothing to compare to, and therefore I see no reason why we couldn't have stayed monkeys foraging in the jungle for all eternity without our consent ever being violated. Proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the member of the opposition. Here.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Opening government tells you that the state is illegitimate because it infringes on freedom. So we shall prove that it expands freedom. Opening opposition says that this debate is not about moral goodness, it's about moral permissibility. Then proceeds to justify the state entirely through a series of things that they say are good, like society and welfare. We will actually explain why it is morally permissible. And, CG kind of points out that OO don't fulfill their own burden and then launches themselves into space with a case that just seems insane. Rob can deal with it. Okay, first question. What is a state? Lots of definitions so far. We're just going to say this debate appears to be asking a theoretical question about whether the concept of a state is legitimate, not whether practical implementations of a state are legitimate. We're happy to concede that some states are bad. The question is the idea of having a state good, or is it permissible or not? And that is what we will defend, the theoretical concept of the state. What does that mean? It's just the exclusive capacity to enforce violence, right? What it means is things like, the capacity to enforce laws, rights, and the provisions of goods and health and welfare. It is merely the capacity to, as CG says, without unanimity, enforce common rules. And that is what we are going to prove. So how are we going to do that? Very simply, we're just going to take the premise of the Gov bench that state restricts freedom and explain why the state necessarily expands freedom and therefore is good. Why is that the case? Firstly, what does freedom look like in the absence of any limits on itself? We tell you that it does not look very good, right? Because in a world where you are able to do anything, anything can happen to you. And that necessarily means that while you have the capacity to do whatever you want, you are not really free, right? Like in a world where you constantly fear being killed, you are not really free. So necessarily, in order for rights to exist, freedoms must be limited because freedoms conflict with each other in innumerable ways. And that suggests that freedom can be maximized by limiting itself. At the point in time where limits are imposed on what freedom looks like, people feel more free to engage in the actions that they want to do, right? Like freedom is not about the total capacity of actions that you can engage in. Freedom is about the extent to which you are able to engage and fulfill your preferences. And that is obviously something that exists to a greater capacity at the point in time where you feel safe and where you have an understandable, we have an understanding of what is and is not permissible, which suggests that limits are necessary. Why is the state necessary to impose those limits? Opening government gives you this analysis themselves when they point out that people are very different. People's conception of what freedom looks like is very different. And therefore, people's understanding of what should be permissible and what should be limited, like what should be a right and what should be a freedom, considering that they are just reciprocal versions of each other, is necessarily something that they will not agree on. There is no way that you can just get people together in a circle and decide upon what something, like what should be allowed and what should not be allowed, which means that the only way that you can come up with a common set of limits is through a state that does not need unanimity, right? That has the power and the authority to enforce one set of rules upon everyone. Now, the obvious problem that, like, the obvious response Gov is going to say is like, yes, but people might not agree with the conception that the government comes up with. Obviously not. Like, it is the aggregation of preferences. It will not fulfill the desires of everyone. But in a system where people have input through democratic means, it is a system that aggregates the preferences of the vast majority of people and is reflective. But even if it is not a system that is, gracefully reflective of the preferences of everyone, we would contend that that is still a preferable world to life without a state. Why is that the case? Firstly, because it is one that imposes limits that are consistent across everywhere, right? Like, even if those limits do not exactly align with what it is that you would like, they are a set of limits, and it's the only way you can meaningfully impose that set of limits. But secondly, for the reason that it imposes those set of limits in a way that is incredibly certain, right? You need one single arbiter of what is and is not correct. And only the state can decide where the bands of freedom should lie and where they should not lie. And that suggests a huge problem for life without the state. Because how do you decide what is legitimate if you just rely on people to come and interact with each other? In a world where you do not know what is a right and what is not a right, even if you disagree with what those rights and those freedoms are, that is a world in which you do not feel free to exercise those freedoms, right? Because there are still natural consequences that exist to all of your actions. For example, the forces of nature, the fact that other people will interact or react badly to the way that you act. Like, if you do something that other people feel is aggressive and is not permissible, they will kill you, or they will hurt you, or they will engage in any sort of actions that negatively affect your life. You will not feel free to engage in those actions, even though no one is, preventing you from engaging in them. No one is putting limits on you. You are still limited because you do not feel safe to engage in those actions. Only in the world where the lines of what is permissible and what is not permissible are very clearly drawn, and they're drawn in a way that cannot be contested, because a body will stand behind those rules and say that that is the way that things ought to exist. Can you truly be free? Because you have the full capacity to engage in any behavior that you want within the bounds that is being set. And we say that that is a much greater scope of behavior that you are actually capable of engaging in than in the comparative. I will take opening government.
Opening government agrees with the basic claim that to live in the presence of the fear of violence is to live in the absence of freedom. However, our point was that states can exercise much greater violence than any individual smaller community.
Well, I think, like, as a group, the state probably can exercise a lot of violence, but it's not meaningfully clear that, like, the violence exercised by the state is greater than the sum of the parts involved in it. That is to say, like, a war between two countries can be pretty violent, but it's unclear that that is worse than every individual within both of those countries being in a state of constant conflict with each other, which is necessarily what occurs in the absence of the state, for the very simple reason that it's just unclear how you come to any agreement on what sort of actions are permissible, right? And it's not even like some sort of, like, philosophical concept. It's just the idea of any time there is any disagreement between two people, how do you determine what the solution to that problem is in the absence of a final arbiter? That is what the state is, right? It's the court system. It's, the police. It's the law. It's a capacity for someone to say you are right and you are wrong, and that is definitive. And even if that answer is not right all of the time, which it will not be, the fact that there is a answer is what is necessary in this debate. There has to be a final arbiter, and that is something that the state, that is fundamentally what the state is. That is why the state is necessary. At the end of this debate, if you believed that the metric of this debate was who expanded freedom, it was obviously the side that gave you clear rules about what you could do, rather than the side that said you can do anything, but left you feeling unfree to do anything because you did not know what the consequences of engaging in any action were. Decisions could not be made without information. We provided that information. So proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the Gov Whip to conclude the Gov Bench. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. I'm just going to quickly load up my timer while I'm doing so. For points of information, please type your team code in the chat, and I will, at a point during the speech, I'll fish one of them out. So there's no need to interrupt or anything like that. In a moment, I'll do like a 10-9 and give you sort of a lead in, and that will give you an idea of when I intend to begin. Let me just take my jacket off first, purely for Rob's sake. Okay. 10, 9. You've had 6 moral frameworks in this debate. I'm going to make it easy for everyone by just going through them and explaining why CG won on all of them. But first, I want to be clear that Ron gave you 3 simple truths, which are not as insane as Udai thinks. But note, this was probably just rhetoric, given how many times you referred to agreeing with things in Ron's speech anyway. So Ron tells you we should do this under the rules of morality and that intention matters, that it's not immoral for me to be killed by a blizzard because the blizzard lacks the ability to be exercising autonomy and therefore it cannot have negative intent, a precondition for immorality, that this moral framework matters is something that the other teams, in particular in the top half, didn't grasp. Secondly, that consent and human dignity are important conditions of moral legitimacy, that your capacity to be a moral actor matters, and the ability to engage in moral reasoning is a precondition of dignity that is denied by the state, because when you are forced into the conditions of the state, you are no longer able to engage in a moral way, you're no longer able to reason in a moral way, because you are stripped otherwise of those conditions by the necessary sets that the state put in place. Thirdly, in terms of proliferation, that we can't just judge it on the moral existence of one state, because one state necessitates the creation of others, it proliferates to other systems. It's a morality of a system of states which prevents you from ever opting out, that because one state leads to many states, it means you can never opt out, it denies consent in the ways that other teams have said in the debate and asserted based on circumstances. Let's start with OO's framework. It's based on necessity. They say it confers some degree of moral legitimacy. I think we clash on this one pretty directly, so I'll go through it. I think OG do a good job of pointing out this is based on an assertion, based on correlations in our history, assuming all good things were based on the state and all the bad things were unavoidable. We'll go a step further by saying many of those bad things were unavoidable, specifically because of the path we went down to lock us into states and be proliferated in that regard. Whatever the failings of humans are, we say the existence of states allows people to multiply those failures and project them onto others, like war or greed leading to stockpiling of resources within states that deny people from accessing them. We also say it's justified by history, that all states have failed in the execution of their social contracts, but note that that's general analysis. Our response then is in terms of proportionality. We say in the absence of state exercise of power, social hierarchies could have emerged which are preferable, that cooperation without the coercion of power could have existed, and path dependency, we then say, renders it illegitimate because the unique structure of the state leads it to 2 things. 1, your inability to opt out, and secondly, proliferation. The creation of one state necessitates creation of others for 3 reasons. You impose borders, and therefore other states impose themselves beyond your borders to stop your spreading. You require resources, and therefore other states have to form to stop you acquiring their resources. You create citizenship and identity, and therefore others need to define themselves negatively based on that. Very simply, therefore, states necessitate the creation of other states, and it's illegitimate, we say, therefore, that if there could have been another scenario and we were locked into one where we can never opt out and never go back, it is more necessarily legitimate. You can weigh this on trajectory. Unless you can speak with certainty that there was no trajectory on which a preferable moral structure could have been made from 8,000 years ago, which wasn't based on coercion of power, which had no means of opt-out, then you need to conclude it was morally illegitimate to lock us into this spiraling path, which committed us to this global structure forever. You only need reasonable doubt to weigh it on the basis of that proportionality, because any risk that this was an option that locked us out of any ability to morally reason is something that we should heavily err against. Their second justification for this is the assertion you can't live past 50 without the state. But also there's a concession here that if people don't live past 50, it becomes illegitimate. So when states routinely lock people out of resources and lead to the deaths at a young age, that confers the same moral illegitimacy. It means it wasn't necessary to avoid that because you're still not avoiding it for everyone. And insofar as you can't avoid it for everyone, you shouldn't believe it's a moral obligation. And then they say, listen, guys, we need to have the state to access other things which we believe are moral. We need them to access frameworks of control. 2 quick notes. That relies on the idea, firstly, the moral standards now which have emerged from the existence of the state are moral absolutes and not just products of the brainwashing of the manacles of the state or whatever the fuck OG we're talking about. Whatever. Ron did it better when he said, you think with reference to what you already know and it measures how you value things. Secondly, many of those rights are only needed because of the existence of the state, because the right not to be tortured, to not have your free speech restricted, to be able to live your life, these are all only at risk when we give you power as a social structure which is able to amplify and proliferate the worst excesses of humanity. Ron says the existence of rights comes from the inability to refuse. For your ability to refuse them, you need to be able to opt out and choose to exercise rights. You need choice to make rights valuable. That's OO's framework out of the debate. I'll take OO.
Your only positive material is a retread of opening government's claims about consent, but you, like them, do not engage with the moral truth that consent is only important if individuals...
I get it. Like, so first off, that's factually untrue. Like, your best read of that is like we filled in an important gap in terms of consent because we showed why consent is actually lost by these structures because you have no means to opt out, rather than just being like sometimes you don't get to choose decisions and like that's something that happens either way. Like, obviously that's something we can deal with. I mean, I'll just go through that a little bit now. CO's framework of freedom facilitation. Note many of my responses to OO here are able to be the same because it's a subset of OO's case about facilitating absolute goods. I'll note as well, there's a problem with CO's case. It's based on the idea we need to collectivize decision making to access some kind of absolute truth about what needs to happen, independent of any reasoning for that, to the extent that only the existence of states has forced us into close contact and conflict over resources, binding us with rules and laws and forcing us to make these trade-offs. That wouldn't have been a problem if not for the moral hazard they need to defend. We didn't need to come up with a solution to that. We didn't need absolute truth. We've got 5 responses to Menaway. 1, morality is a set of standards which are necessary to respect our humanity. 2, consent is the most primal moral requirement because it is a precondition for anything else to be valuable. 3, the state, by definition, is a social organization which exercises power without unanimous consent, thus demanding a violation of consent in at least some circumstances. 4, because states breed other states by their existence or expand to cover the globe, opt-out is impossible, so the coercion is assured. 5, the goods states grant us are only good from the perspective of having experienced them. If we live in the Hobbesian state, we wouldn't care about that. Those 5 responses are A, your weighing mechanism between us and OG, because it's the depth we add on top of theirs, but also it's rebuttal to opening opposition. And if they think you can't do rebuttal from the whip and still win, then they've got another thing coming because their case is gone. OG's frameworks. Circumstances have been bad. I think it was fair to point out this was an assertion. To the extent you want to value it, it relies on framing Ron gave you that the state would be morally illegitimate if it locked us into circumstances which were bad and imperfect options, were set in a state of failure in the execution of social contracts and made it impossible to pursue other means of organisation. So we would be winning on that framework. Individuality, I think there's an intuitive burden to be crossed here, which they missed. We might still believe these are imperfect. That doesn't conclude them to be immoral. There's a missing gap that is filled when Ron says that to the extent that states proliferate and necessitate other states, they force you into a framework where you cannot opt out or choose your individuality properly. So you must always see to the state what strips your individual morality. That's fine. We can win on that one too. Consent, and this is the one they challenged us on in the POI and claim we said nothing on. I want to be very clear. You can, when OO says you can express control over the state, giving you consent, and maybe you can overthrow the state if it's bad, but not because, I mean, we wouldn't give those dictatorships moral legitimacy, so we wouldn't say that's okay intuitively. But no, democracy itself does not confer legitimacy or consent. And I'll give you a simple analogy why. If someone came to you with 5 hammers and told you they'd given all the hammers different aesthetics, that some are big, some are small, that some are especially experienced in hitting people around the face, and they said, you get a vote for which hammer is going to hit you round the face, that doesn't legitimize you being hit round the face with a hammer. The ability to gain control of a subset of options constrained by the options of others is not the same as consent, and OO totally misses the point here. It also deals with CO's explanation that even if you don't get what you want from the state, it's okay because you were consulted, because consultation is not the same as choice or consent. The fact that you've been stripped down to a subset of options for how you can govern your lives is why consent is limited here. It is why we've won the debate on consent as well. We've won on every moral framework, and we've explained why we win the debate.
Thank you for that speech. Finally, I'd like to invite the opposition whip to conclude the entire debate within 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Right, give us 1 second. Panel, I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but rights and freedoms can only exist because of limits upon rights and freedoms. So Udai's extension does 2 simple things in this debate. What it firstly establishes is that a limit on that freedom is actually a precondition for the existence of those freedoms to the greatest possible extent. And secondly, the state is the only body that can provide this. How does that fit in with the rest of the debate? When we look at the CG extension, I think they do a couple of things. The first thing they do is define a bunch of things that the top half doesn't really define. This is an extension, but not really an argument. It's quite interesting, but doesn't go anywhere. I think the second extension they provide is the really cool background. Ron has a better background than OG. I guess that's doing better than OG. But more importantly, I think what they do is talk about an assessment of how morality is about diminishing humanity or diminishing dignity. I guess that's similar to rights or freedoms like OG already talks about, but just said, I guess, in a different way of looking at it. But either way, our extension is still able to respond to that claim, because when the state is able or exists and is able to enforce and entrench those rights, that is the mechanism by which the greatest amount of our humanity and our dignity is upheld. In absence of the state, where we could go around killing everybody and doing what we want to do, that would, I think, more significantly diminish our humanity. So even if to some extent the existence of a state does diminish a part of our humanity, assuming that's true, it is a lesser percentage diminished than what it would be without a state. And I think from that we can say that it gains moral legitimacy on their metric itself. What about OG then? I think in the same sort of way, their case is entirely hinged on the idea that the state limits freedom, and that is bad. But when our extension proves that the state is the one that actually expands those freedoms, we win on their metric and therefore take the debate because we get maximum freedoms. And our extension fits in with OO quite well here, and I think outdoes them, because OO claim legitimacy does not equal goodness by moral permissibility, but then they base all their harms and benefits around the state doing good things, so the argument folds in on itself and out of the debate. But to push our extension to be even more unique in the debate, I think it goes just beyond the idea that rights exist and how good is medicine and isn't tax great, but to actually respond to the government cases on their own metric and beat them on their own game, not just rely on strange analogies to parents, actually base it on facts. At the end of the day, we give parents rights because children are dumb, not because of some broad moral thought pattern. From that then, let's look at the state as a question. It's not particularly a well signposted issue, but this is issue 2 in the debate. We tell you that the state is about the capacity to enforce violence, but to use that to provide for rights and goods, etc. And there, I think, many definitions in the debate thrown around about what a state is, but ours was the best one. What does CG add on states here? They firstly add a slippery slope argument that one state equals many states. True, but I think more could actually be claimed as being a good thing by their own metric. Because if you believe us that you need a state to enforce rights to access freedoms, then more states narrows the amount of aggregation you have to do so that people have more common interests, so less is taken out of what they want, so they can best express the freedom that they define as being morally permissible. And I know there's a response about the smallest minority is an individual and all men are islands and all that sort of philosophy bullshit. But obviously there's a tipping point. So if we get too small, we lose the capacity to enforce those rights, and that then collapses. So that would not really be what we're talking about. But at the point where the state exists to enforce those things, it does enforce those rights, and therefore it gains that moral legitimacy. The last thing I want to touch on briefly this issue of state is around things like consent. And yes, obviously consent can exist to us existing within that state and how it is governed. And obviously we don't really consent to existing in nature either. But the biggest question here is how then do we determine what is permissible within that? And that, I think, the consensus creator role that the state plays is crucial within that, because the state can't really be illegitimate if it is the one that is the only way that determines what is legitimate, or is the mechanism rather of determining legitimacy. So we can argue what is good or bad, but the reason we decide now what is good or bad is because of the common consensus that's being created, and the state was the mechanism by which that was created and by which we curtail those that act outside that consensus and allow us to express those freedoms. Before I go on, let's take a POI from, why not CG? I like your sign.
We did not use the word freedom because we do not care about these rights that you prioritize. These are constructs of the state in a world in which states are the norm. We care about consent because even in the Hobbesian state of nature, where we are walking around completely oppressed by blizzards, those things cannot be immoral actions against us, and therefore we are granted the maximum amount of consent to govern our own lives.
I mean, arguably blizzards are man-made now because of climate change, but 2, I'd say that being able to express your humanity is like akin to being able to express your freedom, because what is expressing your humanity if not expressing your choice and your freedoms? We're arguing over linguistics here, which is, funnily enough, my next issue is what is freedom? So I think John Farnham tries to answer this in his album Chain Reaction, but Udai, I think, while worse at singing than John Farnham, is better at philosophy. And that is to say that freedom is being able to go about your own life without the fear of others curtailing that freedom or limiting it in ways that prevent you from fully accessing it. And I don't think I think that we what we see here is that when individuals can't agree on what extent those freedoms are and are in constant competition over the capacity to best express their own and their fullest freedom in this. I'm sure all 4 of our teams would love to have the freedom to progress to the grand final, but only 2 of the teams will. At that point, we need some capacity to determine what those 2 are. And I think this is why the state becomes the crucial and only morally legitimate body in this debate, because it is the capacity to by putting limits on the capacity of individuals to express their own freedoms, we maximize the capacity to express their own freedoms, because they no longer live in fear that their actions will result in them being killed or being harmed in some other way. And I think the thing here is that all of the teams in this debate have a weird back and forth about cavemen and how they operated. But I don't fucking know. I know Jess is in the call and Dom's on the Adge course, and maybe they know what it was like in prehistory. But absent of that, I think what Udai does is explain why, in the generality described by the motion as CG calls it, how and why people were likely to act out of incentives to maximize what they want to do. And it's because we can't all get around and agree what those freedoms are, but we all agree that we should have the most freedom possible, that's why the state is legitimate then, because it is the one that it is the body by which we ensure those freedoms are accessed. So on all the metrics of the government bench, we take the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fine speech, and thank you for the entire round. Yeah, so as we'll be using this room for deliberation, it would be nice if teams can leave this call after a while. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.